£1,000. That's too much to spend on a compact camera, right? That's what's probably held me off buying this camera this long, but you guys over on Instagram was telling me that if I was to try it, that I would absolutely love it. And to be honest, I've not been this excited about a camera in a long time. I know I'm 632 days late to the party, but you're still gonna let me in, right? However, the camera is also not perfect, so we're gonna talk about my first week with this camera. I was gonna wait a whole month until I did a review, but it's just too good to wait. And let's kick this off with the build and design of this camera. Now, the really obvious thing is it's small. It is a compact camera, and it does truly fit in your pocket. Whilst I was in Brighton shooting for the weekend, this lived in my pocket and not in my camera bag. But what's probably most surprising, unless you already know about these cameras, is the fact that this tiny little camera doesn't have a micro four thirds sensor, it doesn't have a 1-inch sensor. Somehow they have crammed a crop sensor in here. I don't know how they've done it, but to have a pocketable crop sensor camera is probably the biggest selling point of this camera. And I think one of my biggest concerns coming into the ownership of this camera was I worried that it was going to feel cheap and plasticky. I think the all black version, just looking at pictures, makes you feel that it looks a bit cheap. Turns out that was definitely a misconception of mine. They have a metal body, and I'm conscious that I've got the slightly more premium urban edition, but it feels great when it comes to the actual materials. I think the only downside for me that stands out is the buttons and dials do feel a little bit cheap compared to more premium mirrorless cameras, like the dial on the top wobbles around a little bit and the dial on the back doesn't feel all that great. I think the only thing I don't like about the design of the camera is probably the exposure compensation dial. It's like a flicky switch rather than a dial, and I, to be honest, would rather a dial was there. I've got the optional thumb grip on the top, which definitely makes holding the camera a little bit better, but I do think they've done an awfully good job at making such a small camera comfortable to hold. The grip on the front, although it's quite small, definitely fits my hands well, and I actually found it really comfortable to use, even though it's quite small. So that's all boring, right? Who cares about the build? What's this camera actually like to use? Now, first of all, the boot up time is really quick. I did worry about that a little bit, knowing that it had to pop the lens out the front, but it definitely boots up in less than a second. When it comes to autofocus, I was using single point AF, I was using the touch screen to move that focus point around, and I was also using single shot. Now, in good light, I found the autofocus to be what I would call good. It wasn't amazing, it wasn't bad, it was good. For me personally, it's more than acceptable for travel and street photography. You probably wouldn't want to use it for sports. When it comes to low light, the autofocus isn't that great. I can't remember the last time I saw a light come on to try and help a camera focus. It feels like old phone vibes, but it does come on. You can turn it off, but if you turn it off, it is gonna hunt even more. I found low light autofocus hunts. In good light, it's more than good enough for me. Now, I'm personally what I would call a nervous or maybe shy street photographer. I don't like running around and sticking big cameras in front of the faces of people I don't know. Now, even with cameras like the X100V, I find myself feeling a little bit awkward taking photos of strangers. Now this thing, it just completely changed my mindset, and I know a lot of this is in my mind rather than it being real, but running around with this small little camera and taking pictures of strangers, it made me feel more comfortable than I've ever felt before. And I think that's because, at least in my head, I think people look at you and think you're a tourist rather than a photographer when they see a tiny little camera like this. If you do want to feel a little bit stupid whilst you're using this camera, go and look through the EVF. Put it up to your face, because I found myself doing this a couple times, like struggling to see the screen in bright sunny conditions that we had and kind of going like this and realizing that, stop being stupid, it doesn't have an EVF. Now, I've seen a lot of reviews say the screen on the back of this camera is terrible. Now, that's not true. It's not the brightest camera screen I've ever used, but because you have to depend on it in bright sunny conditions, I did find myself struggling a little bit at times, but it wasn't all that bad. I wouldn't call it rubbish. It's just maybe not as bright as some of the cameras that I've used. And then we come on to battery life. The battery life, you should expect it to be poor. Let's be honest, it's a small camera with a comparatively big power-hungry sensor. Battery life is never going to be great. Now, I think the good news is the batteries are small, so if you want to carry two, it's not the end of the world. But if you do want to run just a single battery, I think I was averaging around 150 to 200 shots, but I was also using the USB-C charging port and a battery bank throughout the weekend, because I don't currently have two batteries, so that was my way around it, and I found it to be okay. But battery life, it's really not great. And then we probably move on to the thing that shook me most. and I don't think I'm over it yet. And that's just how good the images are that come out of this camera. First of all, just talking about sharpness, this camera is sharp wide open and it is sharp stop down. I found myself throughout the weekend swapping between two apertures. I ran aperture priority and I was shooting at f2.8 for some portraits. Because of f2.8 and a crop sensor, you get a pretty good level of background separation, and shooting at f8 as well. And at f8, I just can't believe how sharp the images look. And because you've got a crop sensor in there with a good amount of megapixels, you can crop pretty harshly when it comes to your images. I was blown away at the level of detail that this little camera is able to resolve. This camera is genuinely a little pocket rocket. I've not done too much when it comes to low light photography. I did take a few, here's a couple of 6400 ISO images, but what I have found is the image stabilization in here is so good that you don't actually always have to rely on high ISO. These images around Brighton bandstand were actually shot at a 20th of a second, and I think they look great. Now, knowing that 20th of a second turned out quite good, on the next day, using the ND in the camera as well, I tried to do some kind of slow shutter speed daylight photography. These images are an 1/8 of a second and I still think they look really good. So the image stabilization in here is really good. I can't talk too much about low light. I do think the 6400 ISO images have a bit of noise, but they're still more than acceptable for me. Now, I haven't really delved into messing around with JPEGs yet, but if you are a Fuji recipe lover, then Ricoh actually has a very, very similar setup. And Richie, the guy behind Fuji Weekly, has been providing recipes for these cameras. So I'm gonna delve into that over the next few weeks, but it's a little bit too early to talk about them at this point. When it comes to the RAW files, I've been loving them. They work really well with my stackable preset collection and my old preset collection and work exactly like I'd expect them to. Yet there is an app as well, and you can send RAWs to your phone. Fuji, are you listening up? You can send RAWs to your phone and edit them that way. Which I've said in the past, for me, being able to send files from my camera to my phone and share them on socials is something that I really make use of. And the app is pretty basic, but it works, and it works quickly. So this camera is an expensive compact camera. There's no getting around the fact that this costs £1,000, and even used, especially the X variant, they're holding onto their value really well. But when it comes to image quality, this camera really packs a punch, and it surprised me that there isn't really a compromise when it comes to image quality over going for a bigger mirrorless crop sensor camera. Talking to some of my friends online, it would appear that these do have dust issues. Once you get dust into the camera and on the sensor, you might have to send it away to get it fixed. So I've got a little cap that goes on the front to try and help with that a little bit. The other thing as well is that this camera isn't weather sealed. I would love it if it was. Maybe that's something they might address if they do make a new version. The other big decision you need to make when buying these cameras is whether you go for the X variant like I've got, which is a 40mm full frame, or a 28mm, the non-X variant. Now, I love the 28mm focal length, but I picked the X purposely to give me a little bit of a challenge and to try and force me out of my comfort zone just a little bit. I'm considering doing a bit of a comparison between this camera and the X100V, because I think for me personally, they fill the same niche of that like everyday carry. I'm going to be forcing myself over the next 30 days to take this camera with me everywhere and put the everyday into everyday carry. So if you've got any questions about this camera, then let me know down in the comments and I'll try and get back to you. And if you've enjoyed this video, guys, please do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I really hope to see you in the next one. Cheers.